This lecture is about the sediments that we find in the oceans. Now, if we look at the THARP map of the oceans drained of their water, one thing I didn't point out before is that they're also drained or cleaned free of their marine sediments. So what you're looking at here is the bottom of the ocean as shown with their oceanic crust. So that's all bedrock. And realize that all over that globe then, in the oceans, there's different sources of sediment that are going to be sending or delivering clasts there to cover up that oceanic crust bedrock. This slide is just one that shows different major oceanic sources or inputs of sediment into the ocean. And you don't have to memorize the numbers or that this is 10 to the 9th tons per year delivery, but realize that rivers are number one. These other sources are dwarfed in comparison to what is sort of sent to the oceans by rivers. Had a big sneeze there. If we look at the chart here, now again, a bunch of numbers. I'm not so interested in that you remember the numbers, but just certain features. So notice on the extreme left, it talks about the continental shelves, slopes, rises, and the deep ocean floor. If you look at the next column, the percent of the ocean area, again, you see that the shelf slope rises are small in comparison to the deep ocean floor. But if you look at the column that's highlighted in the pinkish color, you'll see that the percent of the total volume of marine sediments is slightly different. So even though the deep ocean floor is 78% of the area, it's just 13% of the total volume of marine sediments. So when I look at this bottom row here, what I see is that, well, there's very little sedimentation that's going on in the deep, deep oceans. And that kind of makes sense. The previous slide said that rivers are the prominent delivery system of sediments to the ocean, and the rivers are throwing this stuff out on the continental shelves. So you might think, well, shouldn't the continental shelves have the highest percent? Maybe, but remember that the continental shelves have submarine canyons, and the sediment that's building up on the shelves every once in a while gets thrown off the shelves into the deeper parts of the ocean. So, but not the deep, deep, deep ocean, right off the shelves. And so that's the slopes and the rises where the percentage volume is. Now, if you go and then look at the average thickness of sediment, that's another interesting thing. The deep ocean, well, that's consistent. Huge area, small percentage volume, so the average thickness is small. The continental shelves are not the highest percent volume, but they are rather thick, and so that's consistent as well. But now look at the slopes and the rises. The sediment that makes it to the shelf gets flushed off the shelf to the slopes and the rises, and so you have the thickest parts there. Just some interesting things to think about without actually memorizing all the numbers. We can talk about how fast these sediments accumulate. Now, accumulate is here, it's given in weird terms, millimeters per 1,000 years or meters per 10 to the 6 years. Just think of it again as how fast is sediment accumulating. And the higher the number, the faster this stuff is building up. So the abyssal, in other words, the deep, deep ocean, look at these low numbers, 1 to 3 millimeters per 1,000 years, 3 to 200 plus millimeters per 1,000 years. These are low numbers. So out in the deep ocean, very little sediment accumulates each year, or each 1,000 years, as it were. Then compare to the shelf, slope, rise, and you see that all of these are kind of in the the sort of mid-level, or well, they're high compared to the deep, but mid-level. But now look at the coastal and deltaic areas. So right at the coast where the ocean meets the land, and then particularly the deltas where sediment is coming down rivers and immediately put out into the ocean. 10 to the 3 to 10 to the 5. So much, 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 much bigger. So sediment is delivered here first. It migrates across the shelf, down the slope, down the rise, and out here it rarely even makes it. And we're going to find out that these clays and oozes, most of them don't have a source the same as the sediments that are over here. So before we talk about that, how do we sample sediment on the bottom of the ocean? There's a whole bunch of different ways, and here's a very primitive, simple one. It's called a clamshell sediment sampler. The thing is, it's very hands-on. You have to be on a boat out in the ocean. Somebody handles it. You set the lock, throw it over the edge, let it chain all the way to the bottom, and then when it hits the bottom, it clamps up, as was shown in the previous slide, and you pull it up and you get a sediment sample. A second type of way which we get sediment is a piston corer. This one is also sort of thrown off a boat, and sort of it rides a line down to the bottom, and then it gets forced into the soft sediment. It slowly caps the bottom and then pulls up, and you get a cored sample of the bottom. But most of our knowledge of sediment comes from, think back to the plate tectonic lectures where I showed you the ocean drilling project sediment cores. That's where we get most of the stuff, information on sediments. Now, the types of sediments. 4 major types. You need to know the big 4, and you need to know where they come from, some examples. You don't need to know the memorization of the percentages here, but realize what's big and important and what's not so much. So we're going to go over each of these 4 in turn. First, terrigenous. This is the stuff that comes from the land. So in the picture here, you're looking at the land meeting the ocean at the beach. This beach is all terrigenous material. I think your textbook calls it lithogenous. They are the same. It is the most abundant by volume. So this is the most important. If we look at, I mentioned before that rivers are the primary source of delivery, and here's just a suite of different rivers. The Mississippi is probably the one that most Americans are used to thinking about, but look at all these other rivers that are much, much, much bigger in terms of amount of sediment that's delivered. Looking closer for us at home, major river drainages, well, there's our Mississippi and its delivery, its drainage basin, but also it shows the Colorado and the Columbia Snake, etc. Besides rivers, there's wind delivery. So here you're looking at a giant coastal dune in Africa, a field of dunes behind them, and this is blowing off in this direction to meet the ocean, and it gets blown out there. I like this picture a little bit better because here's a person standing here at the crest of one of these coastal dunes. You can see the wind picking up the sand and taking it out, and it goes pretty far. Again, a satellite view of the same thing. Here's a bunch of sand dunes right by the ocean. You can see the streams of sand going out here. Well, it can go much, much farther. So if the particle sizes are smaller, silt sizes, mud sizes, they reach us. Basically, it can cross whole ocean basins and reach us. We think about terrigenous processes. Well, if you've had this in a general geology class, you'll remember it, but first we have weathering. So you have to weather the land that's exposed. Whatever is exposed or broken apart then needs to be transported and ultimately gets deposited. For us, then, we're worried about deposition in the ocean. Then, once it's in the ocean, it's going to take a while before it actually gets lithified or becomes sedimentary rocks. That's geology, so let's go back to these processes. There is physical weathering and chemical weathering. Physical weathering is just breaking things down into smaller and smaller bits. The largest boulders, largest mountainsides get broken down to sand sizes, mud sizes, smaller, very, very small. Chemical weathering is the changing of the bonding. So it's breaking of pre-existing bonds. So when you're sampling river water, yes, it contains the H2O, but it also contains all the sediment, the physically weathered products, and also it has a chemical cocktail of things that it's dissolved from rocks that are delivered to the ocean. If we look at a map of the oceans and their sediment types throughout, you see the continents are shown in brown and the terrigenous sediment is shown in white. And notice the white sediment is basically outlining the continents everywhere they are. So, and that makes kind of sense. You've got weathering of this land here. It's dumped very close to the actual source. What's doing it? Erosion and transport. On planet Earth, we use water, wind, and ice, and water is the primary one. So rivers deliver it. Deposition. We also call this sedimentation, and these are the dumping of those clasts in a given environment. So here's a beach. You know it is a wonderful vacation location, but it's also a sedimentary environment where sand or clasts have been deposited. Now, sediments themselves and sedimentary rocks are described by their textures, which is very important for us to tell environments. And it can do this many different ways, but let's just say we describe the clasts by their size, their shape, and how they are sorted. So in this picture right here, the upper photograph is a slide, a microscope slide of sand grains magnified many, many times under the microscope. There's no scale, but you might think that each of these little sort of separate grains, these color clasts, is between 1 and 2 millimeters in diameter. And the bottom picture shows how sand becomes sandstone. So you see these loose clasts here, different minerals, and pore space or gaps between them. Overburden is the crushing weight of next year's sediment, the sediment after that, the sediment after that. Ultimately, they get squeezed and scrunched together, and then you see cement, which is like gluing them together. Where does that cement come from? Well, that's the ions, the chemically weathered ions that are also in this water. Let's talk about the clasts. Clast sizes. We can say for us that any clast that is larger than 2 millimeters, we're going to call it gravel. This is rare in ocean environments. If we do have it, it is at active margins, basically at continent or convergent plate boundaries. And so here you see these scale bars for these two sedimentary rocks, and you see most of them, if each of these little tick marks is a millimeter, most of them are much larger than a 2 millimeters. So these are gravels. If, though, put stars by this, emphasize this, if you're looking at clasts between 2 millimeters and 1/16 of a millimeter, well, that's sand. And the oceans have lots of sand. So sand clast sizes are the most abundant in the littoral, which are the beach environments. And then if you've got things less than 1/256th or 1/16 of a millimeter, very, very small. We have several different categories here, but let's just say smaller than sand, mudstone. And the volume abundance of muds increases offshore. So you have sands in the beachy areas near shore, and the farther out you go, the more muds you get. The second aspect of texture is rounding, and so this is looking at all the individual clasts, and we sort of grade them as either well-rounded or poor-rounded. So when you look at these pictures here, you see each of these individual little clasts is relatively rounded. Now notice it's not the shape of the whole rock, which is these perfect little spheres for you. It's the clasts within. The clasts shown in the rock on the right side, rock B, notice they have lots of jagged angular little points. So I would rate this as well-rounded for A and poorly rounded for B. And this generally is going to reflect how long or how far these clasts have moved. And then just some different examples of rounding. And so you can look at each of these and imagine, well, is this rounded, poorly rounded, well-rounded, etc. And then here's the spectrum shown up here. Clasts start out as A, jagged, angular, poorly rounded, and then over time, over distance, the edges get smooth, just like in a rock tumbler, till you reach C. And then finally, sorting. We can talk about sorting as being poor to well sorted. The sands over here are all about the same size, so this is well sorted. On the rock B to the right, you have big clasts, smaller clasts, medium-sized clasts, really small ones, and then all these little black specks in here would be really, really, really small ones. This would be poorly sorted. So sorting measures, well, how many different sizes of pebbles do you have or clasts do you have? Just another thing to think about. Here we're looking at two rivers that are both delivering water and sediments to the ocean, and the river on the right, or the left, excuse me, is high in the mountains, and notice it has big, jagged, angular boulders. It is immature. This makes sense. When you're near the mountains or far from the ocean, you have immature sediments. As they travel in rivers across the continents and ultimately reach the ocean, like the river here shown on the right side, because the ocean is just off the slide to the right here, you see just sands. They're all about the same color. If you examine them, they'd all be well-rounded. So there's well-rounded, well-sorted, mostly one thing. This is mature. So sediments go from immature to mature. Textural maturity. Immature sediments usually at the near shore area only. It's very hard to find immature sediments anywhere out there in the continental shelf, slope, rise, deep ocean. It's usually right there by the beach, by the land. And then mature sediments, well, we find those everywhere, but they increase offshore. Things to remember. Second major source of sediments are biogenous sediments, and you see a coral reef here with a bunch of fishes swimming over it. Who knows how many other little small shelly critters are in there. When they die, their skeletons stay on the ocean floor. Their skeletons act as sedimentary particles, and so we say that they are biogenous. They're from biology. If you go by volume, these are the second most abundant sediment types on planet Earth. We're an Earth planet that has lots of life with skeletons. When they die, their skeletons become part of the sediment. It is the most abundant by cover. That's an interesting thing to think about. So the terrigenous rocks are most abundant by far, but biogenous, most abundant by cover. This is going to be because way out in the middle of the ocean, terrigenous sediments rarely reach out there. And instead, you just have creatures like this here, plankton, and when plankton die, their little tiny microscopic skeletons just rain slowly down in the deep ocean. And so we have these siliceous, SiO2 or calcareous skeletons, depending upon the plankton creature, raining down in the ocean to make the biogenous sources. If we look at this diagram here, this kind of shows you what we've been talking about. Right near the shore, you've got all this terrigenous sediment, and then it piles up on the shelf. It is delivered to the slope and the rise by these submarine canyons and really just overabundance of this stuff continually shuffling down. The slope and the rise, still dominant in terrigenous, and then once you get out in the deep, it's going to be almost all biogenous with the raining down of these planktic creatures. Now you do have places near to the shore, like this organic reef, where you do have an abundance of biogenous sedimentation up here in this normally terrigenous area. They are mostly carbonate rocks. Carbonate rocks are like what's shown there. They are a mixture of lime, mud, and fossil skeletons cemented up, and it becomes the rock stone that most of you know, limestone. So warm marine environments, and we typically describe those not with sorting, rounding, sizes. We talk about the ratio of fossil to mud in the thing that you're looking at. So here's just some different samples of limestone with the visible fossils that you can see. Same slide here, a couple of unique rock types. Chert is a biogenous sediment from deep ocean basins, and the upper two pictures are microscopic slide photos of these skeletons. Both of these are showing skeletons that are much, much smaller, from 100th to 1,000th the size of a millimeter. But these planktic creatures are so abundant out in the ocean that their bodies rain down by the billions to the billionth power, and they make these oozes at the bottom of the seafloor. Well, if their skeletons are made of silica, like these things we call radiolarians and diatoms, it makes a silicious ooze that hardens to become the rock type chert that a lot of Native Americans have used in the past to make their tools. Chalk is another type of sedimentary rock or biogenous sediment. Here the skeletons are from coccoliths, which are calcareous plants. They can be so abundant that they turn the water, the ocean waters, green. The upper right picture here is a satellite photo of Alaska. So the brownish part is Alaska, and this is the Gulf of Alaska in summertime, turned green because of so many coccoliths floating around in the water. Basically, the water is filled with planktic plants. When they die, their skeletons rain down and they make the rock-type chalk, which can be made in either warm water or cold water, like this Gulf of Alaska, but it can make thousands of feet. And then the picture over here is just ancient chalk examples from the Normandy area of France. The third type of sediments that are abundant on the ocean floor are the hydrogenous. And hydrogenous here literally means they're sort of grown or life from water. So the water, I've already said, is super saturated with different chemicals, and in some places it has so much of different things, manganese, iron, carbonate, whatever, that it literally starts precipitating out of the seawater. And one of the most common or striking examples in the ocean floor are these things called manganese nodules. So that's shown in the bottom right corner here. You have these little balls or disc-shaped rocks that literally just grow on the seafloor because there's so much iron and magnesium and manganese growing there. It precipitates out of seawater. Bacteria do help, so there is an element of biogenous to it, but the bulk of this rock would be hydrogenous. The next slide simply shows how they grow on the seafloor, and there's some places where they litter the seafloor for hundreds to thousands of square miles. These things are rich, as I said before, in manganese, magnesium, iron, sometimes other weird metals, to the point where, again, humans repeatedly talk about mining them off the bottom of the ocean floor. No one's successfully done it in a big way yet, but it's a source of these metals that are needed for our modern society, and there it is. I predict that at some point somebody's going to try to get them. Another slide just showing, where they grow. They grow right at the sediment, what we call the sediment-water interface. You have an upward migration of iron and manganese, downward precipitation of these things, and they grow right at that horizon. If you took one and sliced it in half, you'd see that they have these concentric circular lines around them. And it shows that they grow around a first little piece of sediment, and it just sits there and adds layer after layer after layer on the outside. If we look at this map again of sediment distribution over the globe, notice that in different places out here in the Pacific, they show many manganese nodules growing. Hydrogenous sediments are shown in this light blue or sort of aqua color, and notice they are predominant out here in this sample near the deepest or farthest point away from terrigenous areas. The bunch growing over here on this western coast of South America, and it's mostly because the bulk of the rivers of South America don't flow in this direction towards the west, they're flowing towards the east. And so there's not a lot of terrigenous sediment swamping the ocean floor here. And then finally, the fourth source of sediment is cosmogenous. Basically, it arrives from space. And so in the photograph here, you see a giant asteroid hitting planet Earth. Well, that's a big arrival of cosmogenous sediment. But we are sort of hit, if you will, by tons of very, very small mud-size space dust. Look at this. The estimates are between 16 to 33 tons per year fall all over planet Earth. If we map these things in a different way, you can sort of see the same thing as before: hydrogenous deposits, calcareous oozes, terrigenous or continental margin deposits shown in white. I put this up here just so you see a different map of the same thing. But if I go back to this one, again, you would see terrigenous as white near the continents. Calcareous ooze and siliceous ooze are the dark blue or purplish and black, and they are predominant out in the deep ocean basin. Where you have hydrogenous dominance is usually farthest away from everything. So farthest away from land, less biogenous sedimentation. That's it. Then red clays. Notice red clays form huge portions of the ocean floor. These are places, and red clays usually come from weathered iron, which can be blown out onto the oceans. But red clays also have a huge amount of cosmogenous deposits. So you can look at a map like this and imagine the four different sources we've talked about and where they came from, where they are abundant, where they can be expected to be found. When we think about the life of the oceans, you can think about the different types of life and where they are found by the sediment that's preserved on the bottom of the ocean floor.